this one started. Excellent. Yeah. Hello, welcome to week 4 of Counterpoints. We're in the middle of week 4, and week 4's theme is body. And we're going to listen to a talk by Paul Collinson. I have to admit, I've never really spoken much to Paul before, but as we were going through a lot of the bits of ephemera from the early 90s, pictures of Paul were all over those items. Key arts being one of the things. Yeah, exactly. You weren't the one who had to sort of trawl through that stuff, but yeah, that was good. So, we're going to listen to Paul, and then hopefully we'll have some opportunity for some questions. And I'll hand you over to Paul Collinson.
Thanks, Thomas. Well, thanks all for turning up on such a lovely day. I feel really honoured that you've taken the time to come here and sit in an art gallery rather than be outside in the heat. I must also sort of take this part just to do a few thanks. Firstly to Annalie Judah Fine Art, who provided me with a PDF version of the Alan Charlton exhibition catalogue from 2018, his exhibition called Grey Paintings. They sold out the paper version, but the person I spoke to at the gallery said, don't worry, we'll find you the original artwork for the catalogue, and they sent me a PDF version, which, as I go through this presentation, you'll see how informative and necessary that was. And similarly, a thanks to you, Tom, for providing me with the PDF of Myth, a great experience, meanings and metaphors. I mean, if you've actually viewed Paul Hughes' thesis, his final year's thesis, which you provided me with, you'll see how it was formatted for presentation for his final year work. So it's kind of a unique document in itself. And finally, I'd like to thank everybody from Harry who actually brought all this together, because I mean, it's a tremendous undertaking, and thanks to the host venue as well for providing such a really good venue and being involved. And also for providing me with this opportunity to do something as part of undertaking, because the phrase "now the use nor ornament" had been kind of hanging around in my head for a number of years. It first occurred to me when I was visiting an exhibition in London, the Blythe Gallery, of another artist colleague who put a show together and said, "What do you think about it?" I said, "Well, a lot of the work is now the use nor ornament." Maybe I shouldn't have said that, but the more I thought about it, the more it became relevant to me as a visual artist, and I hope also what I talk about, what I present now, will show that. In my bringing the ideas together in writing this talk, I wrote it to be read silently rather than vocalised like I'm attempting to do soon. So it can sound very academic, and it's very dense. So some of the ideas you might try and take in, but then it'll be moved on. But I'm sure there will be a version for you to read after the exhibition. So I'm not going to worry about that too much. So I'll just crack on and see how we go. So, Tank, a painting of "Now the use nor ornament." "Now the use nor ornament" is a collocation, bringing together of two words that go together, like chalk and cheese or something like that. It's usually a pejorative term for something or someone that has neither a use value for doing something practical and not having any aesthetic value for our own visual pleasure as well. However, I would like to propose that this is exactly where the idea of art finds a place in our world, and I will confirm this proposition through a closer examination of painting as inexhaustible object and as something in itself, not as the self-validating art for art's sake, l'art pour l'art, the kind of Baudelaire 19th century kind of bohemian thing, but as something necessarily autonomous and ungraspable. I think this is where Paul Hughes' painting, Tank, actually situates itself. When the term in itself is used, this immediately brings us into the realm of philosophy, and specifically that of ontology and latterly phenomenology. So whilst I'll be using ideas from the existential phenomenologist Martin Heidegger and Nicole Dufresne, along with the Marxist philosophy of Theodor Adorno, I'm also going to be going back to revisit Michael Fried's seminal essay, Art and Objecthood, from 1967, and to Paul Hughes' own fine art degree thesis of 1997, a great experience, meaning of metaphors, and his painting Tank that's behind you from his final degree show, as an example of autonomous thing in itself without aesthetic value. The etymology of ornament has its origin in ancient Latin as the verb ornare, to equip, with the word having a more functional origin from the Latin, which was originally used within a military context to equip a soldier with arms and clothing. The use in English we now generally have for the word arose from the relative stability of the English state after the War of the Roses, as a means of ostentatious display of wealth and status, although Shakespeare was still able to use both roles as equipping the soldier and as ostentatious display of decorative use. We now take the word ornament as an object without practical purpose, but with added aesthetic value. I will discuss the word aesthetic later, but I want to start with the word object. Michael Fried's 1967 essay, Art and Objecthood, was a response to the appearance of minimalist art in the 1960s, as exemplified by the paintings of Frank Stellert and Kenneth Nolan, and the three-dimensional work of Donald Judd and Tony Smith. Fried was also challenging a previous misconception provided by his mentor, Clement Greenberg, from 1962, in which Greenberg claimed that a stretched or tacked-up canvas already exists as a picture, although not necessarily a successful one. Here is Greenberg's flatness, this modernist flatness, the picture painting, that defines a painting and the look of non-art that was being attempted by painting, through which painting would achieve this objecthood. Here, Greenberg is still positing that the flat canvas is a painting, the tacked-up bare canvas is a painting, not an object, as, according to Judd, who Fried was quoting in his essay, objecthood and the end of painting could only be achieved by the three-dimensional presence that sculpture could bring, and which painting had to mimic. There seemed to be a tussle going on here between exactly what the work of Stellert, Nolan, Judd, Smith and those other minimalists wanted to be, whether they wanted their works to be art or non-art, to be just another object out there in the world, or something created anew as art. But there was no getting away from the fact that putting these objects, whether they were just saw them as objects or art objects, in an art gallery, they became accepted as artwork, and thus continued the existence of these art objects as a cultural undertaking and presence. And in doing this, they were actually relying on the institutions. Fried was calling these new works essentially theatrical, in that, in his opinion, they required the participation of the individual viewer within the setting in which these works were and are placed to be art. And through this necessary participation, the viewer became part of the artwork being viewed. Fried's use of the term literalist in his essay is a further denigrating of the work of Judd and his fellow minimalists. This is more to do with the linguistic conceptual understanding, the literalist understanding of the so-called paintings as a specific object, rather than essential and aesthetic object, and therefore the apprehension of a painted surface. The death of painting, as proposed by Donald Judd, therefore still relied on the cultural situation at the time, and the exposing of the institutional nature of art. Yet in Freud's essay, the use of the word object, as used by Judd, would seem to be more to do with the physical presence of a single entity, a monadic entity, a sculpture or specific object. This is where I would like to introduce Paul Hughes' painting, Tank, as I encountered it in a warehouse venue in Hull's Old Fruit Market area in 1997. As I recall, the lighting in the warehouse, repurposed by Hughes, was minimal, and Tank was placed on the back wall of the large space, the warehouse space. At the rear of this space, where Tank was positioned, was a low mezzanine, so in effect Tank was not just fixed to the back wall, it was also raised above the usual eye level of anyone immediately entering the space. I had read Freud's essay, Art and Objecthood, as part of my own research for my final year thesis called An Art Strip to Burn. In my own writing, however, I was more concerned with how the 1950s and 1960s colour field painting of Barnett Newman, Mark Rothko and Ad Reinhardt achieved their aims through the application of their paint, and how their work was intended to be received sensually and critically at their point of origin and afterwards through the use of this field of colour painted on a large canvas surface. There is an obvious crossover in both Paul's and my own academic interest in the minimal use of colour and lack of colour, especially through my interest at the time in Ad Reinhardt's so-called black paintings, and certainly the painting curriculum at the Hull School of Art and Design included the modernist agenda of a formalist and materialist approach to painting. So Paul and I would have had a similar sensibility when it came to painting and what could be achieved through our respective practices with materials. But the intended aim of our respective subjects of research was different. One being the sensual use and associative role of colour, the other being the implications of the non-colour grey, where Reinhardt used the square shape of his human scale painting and subtle use of differing hues of black to create the illusion of a cross and remain painting art, as Reinhardt called his dogma. Hughes made a blatant use of the shaped canvas that appeared to meet and fulfil the criteria for Freud's and the 1960s minimalist painters' desire for a shaped painting to be received as an object. Newman's and Rothko's painting, however, was rather more an attempt at invoking a theological reading of their respective works. This is evident not just in their works themselves, the scale, the colour, but more so in the titles that Newman gave his work, and Rothko's culmination in his work, creating the Rothko Chapel in Houston. Paul Hughes saw himself very much as a painter and maker of artwork, even though his thesis opens with his declared interest in drawing and seeing the world without colour. This is confirmed by his interest in Alan Charlton's work. What Charlton was and is interested in is reducing the painting content and process to the bare minimum whilst retaining the concept of painting through a rigorous making process. Charlton's work was an ethical undertaking of craft-like making whilst hiding the way the painting is actually made. The timber support of standard 4.5 centimetre trade timber, plain timber, the use of industrial over-the-counter grey trade paint to emphasise the prosaic day-to-day of the industrial and the workmanlike object, but not the specific object that Judd and his contemporaries were aiming for by using a single monadic thing as sculpture. As such, they do not become the specific object as demanded by Donald Judd. Freud's essay, Art and Objecthood, opens with a quote from Perry Miller's biography of the 18th century theologian Jonathan Edwards. This epigraph, used by Freud, is Edwards, this 18th century theologian's view of the world, now quoting the epigraph here as used by Michael Freud, The world exists anew every moment, that the existence of things every moment ceases and every moment renews. This was Jonathan Edwards' view of a world of mere appearance provided by his God. These words were very much at odds with the Enlightenment worldview at the time of writing his words in the mid-1700s. Edwards was the perceiver of what his God was creating for him every time he, Edwards, experienced the world of objects and things. In the mid-1700s, how we as humans related to and understood the world was being redefined following the so-called Copernican revolution a century previously as proposed by René Descartes and then taken up predominantly by German idealist thinkers such as Immanuel Kant in the 1700s. In their metaphysics, the world of objects was created by us, humans within our own consciousness, in the time and space that we determine. The objects in this created space and time have appearances, but do not exist as objects in themselves, and as such, we as perceivers can never fully know the thing in itself in a non-specific way. This is what Kant called noumena. As it is beyond our own knowledge of the thing through our own experience and perception, we can't actually grasp philosophically what something is. It's beyond our comprehension. We can only do it through get at the being of what a thing is for our knowledge, through our own reason and rationality, through using science, through data collection and observation that we gather and then represent. It was the later phenomenology of Martin Heidegger that provided a new proposition on how we relate to things in the world, both human and non-human. In his series of lectures from 1935 to 1937, he proposed that a great artwork will reveal the truth of the era of its making through that art. In his series of lectures that were ultimately collated in the essay The Origin of the Work of Art, Heidegger uses Van Gogh's painting A Pair of Shoes as a means of exposing the equipmentality of the peasant shoes as depicted by Van Gogh, and for Heidegger supposing the life and toil of their owner at the time when the work was painted. Although exactly which painting or paintings by Van Gogh Heidegger had used is still open to question, as his critique would appear to conflate at least two of the many paintings of shoes Van Gogh made during his life. It may be that Heidegger got the wrong shoes, as Meyer Shapiro has pointed out since in a famous essay which then kind of created a whole kind of dialogue about the shoes, Van Gogh's shoes. Although Heidegger supporters insist that this does not undermine the main premise of the lectures. Heidegger is not much interested in how the artist has rendered the subject matter, as it was the artwork, the thing in itself, that reveals the world and of its creation, and ultimately our own relationship to the world of things, their being, by our abandoning of current preconceptions of what art is and by removing the artwork from all relations to anything other than itself, to let the art object be self-sufficient. In doing so, Heidegger promised that the truth of his historic people would be unconcealed by the art, but this merely reflected his own worldview of a Western philosophy both before and after World War II. This self-sufficiency, the lack of any equipment role, as Heidegger points out, is the real intention of the artist. But in doing so, the creator of the artwork becomes inconsequential, as the work must remain an artwork into the future, although it will be a different artwork from when it was created, and this future presence of the artwork relies on preservers, the museum and gallery workers, the so-called culture experts, to validate the artwork in this future. Heidegger uses the ruined temple as another example of great art, at Peston near Naples to example this idea of brickwork that are no longer in the world they were created. And when he says world, he means the whole environment, everything, when that was created sort of 4 millennia ago, 2 millennia ago. As these artworks create new worlds at their origin but become something else in the future era. In this example of the ancient Greek temple, it is now a preserved archaeological ruin and cultural artefact, rather than a place of worship and a real home of the gods that the creators believed in, existed and resided in this temple, as intended millennia ago. For Theodore Adorno, the artwork had to be an autonomous entity, something that cannot be reduced to the requirements of society and its culture. Any social role was doomed to failure, for even when an artwork challenges the social structure, it will be just confirming the structure it challenges. In his posthumously published work, Aesthetic Theory, Adorno foretold the burden to be placed on the artwork and the artist for a empirical world, and in Adorno's words, bring forth another world. Yet as something in the world, it is still related to the world by it being in contrast to the world. And explaining artwork by biography and context merely turned it, the art, in Adorno's words, into anthropomorphism that echoed the world and values of the viewer. Going over to the word of value now. For the French phenomenologist Maurice Merleau-Ponty, the word value is a word of science and one that should be rejected as our arbiter of experience in the world. Now, this referring back to Kant, how we measure the world, how we experience the world through science and data. Merleau-Ponty is here saying we shouldn't be doing that. Merleau-Ponty brings a more holistic approach to our relationship with the world and each other. In his 1945 work, The Phenomenology of Perception, he establishes that I can only know what I know, not only by what I think, but what I live through. Merleau-Ponty's phenomenology is where my own and others' experience cross and intersect, and in doing so establishes ourselves in ourselves and with each other, and therefore an understanding of the world of facticity, the facts of objects and non-objects, and of those things that can't be measured or even explained rationally and with reason. This is predicated not just on a common shared cultural world, but on a common and accepted human neurology of visual apprehension, of an agreed perception of things such as colour, shape, space and depth. It is also based on my expectation of my thinking, my cogito that is only accessible to me and me alone. The eye is not an independent and passive organ, as it has been previously, of visual apprehension. It is part of my nervous system that has its own perception, which is interpreted not just by my brain, by my consciousness, my thinking, but my other organs of sensation of my body, along with my active imagination and life experience. And the Germans have a good word for that, it's Erfahrung, and that's an important concept. When we talk about experience, we can either use it as, well, that was a great experience, or my experience tells me, and I'll come on to this later, but for this active imagination and life experience, they use Erfahrung, more of a life experience. For example, how does any visual apprehension take into account possible differing reactions to the same wavelength of the black of ink on paper or the black of the funeral hearse? The eye has so far been the primary function of perceiving and determining phenomena, but as Pierre Bourdieu points out in the introduction to his canonical work of 1979, Distinction, a Social Critique of the Judgment of Taste, the eye is a product of history reproduced by education. As such, our experiences and therefore taste is a relativism, and one primarily predicated by a socio and economic habitus. This is a word that Bourdieu uses as our background, where we come from, and inherited predispositions. And we use our taste not just to determine the world, but to position ourselves in that world. Through cultural relativism, it is our immediate desire for certain pleasurable, sensual experiences, which the Germans call Erlebnis, Leben, life, immediate life experience, and intellectual events, and what we bring and reflect on, that informs our aesthetic judgment. It was Alexander Baumgarten's book, Aesthetica of 1750, that attempted a scientific guide to determining beauty, an attempt at some kind of absolute and scientific value derived from the object itself being considered, whether painting or poetry. In his critique of judgment of 1790, Immanuel Kant's aesthetic judgment is, however, mainly one of judgment relying on a societal consensus, a community of taste, if you like. Kant summarises his more subjective judgments as judging something as being agreeable in it having beauty, it being sublime, or as ethical. Kant's aesthetic is a relativistic undertaking, even in a disinterested pose. So the ideology of aesthetics is just that, an ideology for our mediation with our culture and for the control of that culture to socio-political ends. It is furthermore an ideology that, according to Theodor Adorno, fails to meet its own standards as a way of examining objects and experiences it purports to treat or examine. Adorno is aware of the historic role of the visual arts as ornaments that were once primarily cultic symbols, and that art is forever defined by what it once was, and so must always turn against the status quo and be detached from empirical reality, and therefore contradictorily leave that history behind. Art is only ever for the present. Adorno's art must remain autonomous and without social function to succeed, and that the creators themselves may not fully comprehend what is at hand, nor want to. As Barnett Newman put it in his apocryphal statement, aesthetics is for me what ornithology must be like for the birds. Yet Adorno does seem to contradict himself when he says that the artwork has its own development, its own immanent time, through its appearances and the history immanently sedimented within it, and there the artwork's reality is their history. This would align with Walter Benjamin's historic aura that accumulates around the artwork over time and lends authenticity and validity to the artwork. The artwork is not determined by external history, but has its own within it, and it accumulates this history, like these works do, and this aura over its existence. In his... In his introduction, an introduction to my art criticism, Michael Fried comments that painting is limited to its surface, and it is the focus of attention on this surface that distinguishes them, paintings, from other objects in the world. As Fried puts it, every grain or particle or atom of surface competes for presentness with every other. Here he was talking about the painting of Larry Poon, but this focus of attention was meant to apply to any painting, and that this required attention distinguishes painting from any other object out there. In his writing, Hughes describes his own particular attention given to the surface of his painting to remove all evidence of the painting process, thus making the surface enigmatic. Whilst we've been talking about objects in the generally accepted understanding of something solid that exists in the real world, and the proposition of certain minimalists to return the monadic specific object as artwork, it is the philosopher Michael Defrene who distinguishes between an artwork and the aesthetic object. So I've got two things to remember, artwork and the aesthetic object. in his 1953 treatise, Phenomenology and the Aesthetic Experience. Dufresne positions the spectator as the subject of an artwork's aesthetic presence as aesthetic experience by the spectator giving an artwork their attention. It is we, as the spectator, that then constitutes and makes apparent the aesthetic object as something worthy of our attention. As Dufresne puts it, the artwork is not yet the aesthetic object until the sensuous is recognised by the proper gaze. Of course, this leads us back to Bourdieu's educated eye, but for Dufresne, any aesthetic experience is not totally reliant on cultural tradition and modern aesthetic conformity, for he does say that taste is not the whole organ of aesthetic perception. It can at best either sharpen or dull it. We have an aesthetic experience due to the sensuality of the artwork, whether we understand that or not. Within this constituting of the aesthetic object is the bringing of our feelings to the experience and thereby making accessible the aesthetic object. We may apprehend the expressive, the sensuous, within the aesthetic object created by the artist through our own feelings alone, and so access meaning, the artist's intended idea that is immanent in the work. So our own feelings give meaning to what the artist intended, maybe. It is therefore our plurality of interpretations of the meaning, immanent in the aesthetic object, the artwork enhanced with our aesthetic attention, that brings being to the object. But this demands a certain reservoir of our own feelings be brought towards the aesthetic object for us to become an active performer in making the aesthetic object, not the artwork. If we don't bring our attention and the correct feelings with the proper gaze to the artwork, then the artwork will remain, according to Dufresne, the mere object, the artwork. Now this sounds like the in itself, for itself object, but without the for us attached to it. Does the painting then become a non-artwork when not been appreciated by the discerning eye? Well, obviously not. The artwork is still an artwork, even when stored away from public gaze or situated out of view, like Tank is now. It suddenly doesn't disappear, it's still an artwork, but it may not be an aesthetic object because we are not looking at it. It is still there ontically as an artwork. In return for our considered aesthetic contribution to the artwork, according to Dufresne, this will awaken and form a taste within that spectator, within us. This taste would be an aesthetic taste that would, apparently, do justice to the aesthetic object and therefore the artwork. I don't think the painting Tank will, nor was it the intention of its creator, to imbue us with an elevated judgment of taste. Knowing Paul, he wouldn't have been bothered about that. Rather, this painting is, in the words of Adorno, a tabula rasa that merely echoes the beholder. Dufresne agrees that a spectator might have once been able to lose themselves in an artwork, and in doing so, made themselves like the artwork and gain temporary oblivion. The current era now demands rather that the artwork becomes like the beholder of a lived experience without recourse or reference to the creation of the artwork. But we know how the ethos of making is embedded in Hughes' Tank. This is not the technicality as we now understand technique or craftsmanship, but where techne, a term Heidegger appropriated from classical Greek language for a way of knowing by the artist, something beyond mere knowledge or skill and more akin to nous, another Greek word for the faculty of the human mind for knowing what is true or real. There is no theatre here. We are not obliged to be another Vladimir or Estragon or be actors waiting for God knows what, as demanded by the 1960s minimalists, for that would be a negation of art and towards objecthood as one by Freud, as we've already heard. The artwork becomes just another shaped object out there as fantasised by the minimalist. Tank is not just what it is. It may not allude to anything other than itself, but Hughes' artwork is uncompromising and inexhaustible as a creative art thing. It does not want or need interpretation as artwork, or even acknowledgement as aesthetic object, as evinced by its making and final sensuality. The more interpretation that is attempted, the more being is attached to it, and therefore the more it evades our attempt at getting to that being, as, like Adorno's tabula rasa, it merely reflects back to us our own worldview from that enigmatic grey surface. Thank you. I'm sorry about this, but the more I read that, the more I thought I needed to just add an afterword as an addendum, as a supplement, and amplify some points, because I think I've just left some hanging there. And it's mainly to do with Heidegger, and I know you kind of know Heidegger, what's he got to do all this Heidegger, blah. But I mean, for somebody, a philosopher, probably the greatest philosopher of the 20th century, and whose works are still being used, referenced, in philosophy now, and even in architecture and artwork. So I just want to make a point about Heidegger's use of Van Gogh's painting, or paintings of farmer's shoes, as his example of how a great artwork can bring forward or unconceal, because again, he was a creator of words and inventing new words and making new meanings out of them. So I'm just quoting from him, and if you Google it, it's all out there, don't worry, you can spend hours down the Heidegger black hole. I managed to get out finally. Anyway, unconceal the truth laying within the artwork itself. The artwork itself is not a piece of equipment, for it has no equipmentality, or what Heidegger calls ready-at-handness, Zuhandenheit, another nice German word. So whilst the shoes in this painting can be seen as equipment, the shoes are equipment, or of use for their owner, of being ready at hand, this Zuhandenheit. They are more metaphor for Heidegger in his postulation of how a great artwork reveals the truth. Now, the painting itself cannot obviously be used as a tool, nor be involved in achieving something practical, as I've just presented. As an example of the ready at hand, this word is, or this phrase is created, Heidegger uses a hammer. And basically, if you're using a hammer, you're not looking at the hammer really. A good user of a hammer will be focused on what the nail head or whatever is hitting. The hammer becomes basically an extension of the user's body, ready at hand. So therefore, it's not conscious to the user. It's using it to do something. It's got tool value. Now, if this hammer breaks, if the head comes off or the handle breaks, after a lot of cursing and swearing, the user then takes a closer look at the hammer. So the hammer then becomes present at hand, Vorhandenheit. It becomes an object that he is perceiving. It is made clear to the beholder. And just as you're sitting on the chairs, if one of the legs broke, you'd all then be looking at the chair itself and going, right, okay, I see what's happened here. But at the moment, the chairs are ready at hand, they're being used, and you don't appreciate them. The same with your bank statements. You know, you're looking at debits and credits. Okay, everything's in order, fine. I don't worry about the system. But if you see 2,000 quid's been taken out of your account, all of a sudden, the banking system becomes very real to you. It comes forward to you, and it has a present at hand. So you're focused on this system. So modern philosophers have taken this even further and created this thing called object-orientated ontology. If you have a look on YouTube, put Graham Harman in there. He's a really good presenter of this idea, but he also uses Heidegger as a springboard for this. So again, we're talking about somebody who died in the 1970s, whose greatest work was written in the 1920s, but he's still relevant, as I hope has been made clear just now. So, so as I said, in the case of Tank, in this artwork, there's no tool value, there's no use of it, it's not ready at hand, at best it can be present at hand. the artwork is an autonomous entity that has no purpose beyond that of being in itself. Now, going back to the painting of Van Gogh's shoes, Heidegger was not invoking aesthetics, because I didn't mention aesthetics in relation to Heidegger. I thought, well, this is another reason for the afterword, because he doesn't use aesthetic. In fact, he's quite dismissive of modern aesthetics, and when we say modern aesthetics, it's post-Baumgarten 1750 invention of the term. So basically, Heidegger was, in his essay Origin of the Work of Art, he was basically, I think, presenting his over-romanticised and his own worldview of what he could perceive or what he took as subject matter. He wasn't talking about the object. He just mentioned it as thinginess, because in his view, aesthetics is mainly an immediate experience, this erlebnis, a subjective encounter with an artwork. In this subjectivism, Heidegger sees another symptom of the organised uniformity of what he calls the planetary imperialism of technology. Modern aesthetics was another means of measuring and mastering the world for our own benefit that would ultimately lead to the maximisation of the human being as just another resource. It is in another lecture of 1938, called The Age of World Picture, that Heidegger proposes that by getting out of the aesthetic experience, shall we only reach an entirely different element of the artwork's presence. But that proposal, the post-aesthetic, appears to be dependent on questioning the thinginess of the artwork as object, and one that is supposed to bring about certain conditions, that's Heidegger's words, within us, and any sensory properties it may have should be ignored. So basically he's saying don't bother with the sensual nature of the artwork. Going back to Michel Dufresne and his aesthetic object that requires the viewer to bring a more reflective erfahrung, this bigger, deeper experience, more considered experience by us. This is what the viewer brings to the encounter with the artwork. And again, this sounds like Bourdieu's educated eye, Merleau-Ponty's consciousness that creates the encounter with the world that can constitute, change, the subject, us, the perceiver. So how does that correspond with Freud's writing within this presentation, this text? Well, Freud had certainly read Heidegger's The Origin of the Work of Art by the late 1960s. He uses the words from Heidegger's work in the opening epigram to his publication of his collected essays and reviews published in 1971. In his biography, in Freud's biography, in this publication, he makes explicit reference to encountering and reading Merleau-Ponty's posthumously published The Phenomenology of Perception. And he encountered this and read this whilst we were in Paris apparently in 1960. This would certainly indicate that the source of Freud's expressed view that judgment of value for the art critic begins and ends with the experience. And I would guess this is the longer considered engagement rather than an immediate and intuitive one, as this is pointed out in his note that it is Greenberg who argues that aesthetic judgment can be objective rather than subject. And I'm just going to read Freud's quote of Greenberg, because aesthetic judgments are immediate, intuitive, undeliberate and involuntary. They leave no room for the conscious application of standards, criteria, rules or precepts. The qualitative principles or norms are therefore somewhere in some subliminal operation is certain. Otherwise, aesthetic judgments would be purely subjective, and that they are not is shown by the fact that the verdicts of those who care most about art and pay it the most attention converge over the course of time to form a consensus. So here he's saying, well, basically over time we all agree what great art is and what great art isn't, what the sensuality is and what isn't. So this becomes a kind of objective, take for granted thing. Again, this is Freud quoting Greenberg, his one-time mentor, with which he is now disagreeing with the terms of objectivity and subjectivity when used for aesthetic judgment, which relies on this consensus over time. And this extends to Merleau-Ponty's idea of event, the encounter with our object, which brings about subjectivities in us, the subject. in spite of the subject's accumulation of taste over time. So basically, even our own taste developed over our own lifetime it brings this subjectivity, this idea of event, this consensus of taste on Bourdieu's educated eye. But I would like to finish, really finish, on some words from Merleau-Ponty's last work, published in 1961, and this was after his untimely death, called Eye and Mind. In this essay, Merleau-Ponty brings his attention to the act of painting specifically and how it is a whole body practice of eye, mind and body. So this is Merleau-Ponty. Painting celebrates no other enigma. And when he uses the word enigma, he's referring back to Heidegger's use of the term in his afterword to his essay, The Origin of the Work of Art. Because basically, at the end of all that work, Heidegger basically threw his hands up and said, well, art really is an enigma and you've got to figure it out. So what Merleau-Ponty is saying is this painting celebrates no other enigma but that of visibility. It gives visible existence to what profane vision believes to be invisible. And that really is it. Thank you.
So there's a lot to unpick there, but I think, I don't know if we have any questions from the floor.
I think we'll just let it settle for a bit.
Yeah.
But yeah, I think just to thank Paul for that sort of rigorously researched piece of writing. When we sort of put this out into the world that we were doing this exhibition, we were kind of like asking for input from a lot of people, and Paul was one of the first people to get back to us, and we're just really grateful that that's led to this. And you seem to kind of enjoy what you did, Paul. If I should be so bold.
Well, as I say, I do write as an artist. I like to write and formalise things, but it's kind of given opportunities. So I just thought this was a really good opportunity. As I said at the start, it was this idea of neither use nor ornament, and over the past 30 odd years, when I first encountered that painting, I use the word painting, it's not an object, it is a painting. Because I know, talking with Paul, it had an impact, although that was not necessarily the be all and end all, but I think I've got to remember also that 30 odd years ago, it's probably, I was going to say a bit more wet behind the ears, but I think, within that time frame, things changing, your own attitude change, but having this exhibition, it brought that all back, and as I say, going back to reread my own thesis as well, and reading it and going, wow, this is a good piece of work, so it still stood as a bit of writing I was proud of. And it was just, say, reading Paul's thesis that kindly provided. There were similarities, but I think Paul, from reading that thesis, got to the end of painting pretty quickly. So it was just, that kind of threw up other questions for me, which, as I said, I didn't really want to go into in any presentation or talk. So it was just making use of those experiences that I had 30 years ago.
And there's that, you can't remember the full quote, but the work of art shows the truth of the era. There's a little bit more that goes on after that. But do we think that Tank kind of is of that era and represents that era?
Probably not, no, because I think when Heidegger was using that term, he was talking about great art, and now, what's the definition of great art? I mean, it used, say, a Van Gogh painting shoes, which we now know, and it's taken as accepted. There was a lot of shoe paintings by that artist, They were trying to pin down which one exactly Heidegger was looking at, but I think the kind of consensus is that he may have seen one at an Amsterdam exhibition in the 1920s, but that wasn't the painting that he was referring to, making reference to. There's a lot of contradictions in his work, and the other great artwork is the Temple, and the final one was a poem. I can't remember which one, but anyway. So you've got three examples, but I think this idea of great art or just art can define an era. I mean, I was thinking about this, and you think about stuff like Andy Warhol's Marilyn painting, or his soup tins, his bird boxes. I think that defined that era. You go further back, Duchamp's ready-mades, that was another era. You go back to Monet's Impression Sunrise, that was another era. So prior to that, everything becomes this sort of vague, different blaring of characteristics of art, sort of Renaissance, classical, minimalist, baroque, so on. So I think we're probably too close to this even now.
I think the environment in which it was being made, being in whole, that sort of potentially flatness of the environment, the architecture, the things that were around him were giving that context perhaps to him a little. You talked about kind of the framing of the gallery, but also it's the framing of the artist's experience, perhaps that leads an artist down a particular
I mean, it was discussed, I think, in one of the previous events about, would artwork of that size and scale be able to be made in our city now? Have we got the space which impacts on the artist? I don't know. I mean, I'm sure somebody wanted to make a large painting. They could, but then, as you say, what would be the intention after that, I suppose?
It resonates with me on the sense of the sort of post-industrial greyness of the city, and thinking about that in terms of greyness now. I like to think of greyness as like the non-binary colour, when we say about things being black or white. But I had a kind of question, and that is along the lines of, with your characteristic modesty, you kind of left your own work out of that paper, when quite a pivotal motif for you is the tank. And I was just wondering if it might be interesting for you to talk about a little bit about your use of that as a motif in relationship to Paul's use of the concept tank, just in order to see two very different approaches to a unifying concept.
My tank is a military vehicle, and I think over the past decade I've used that more of a kind of metaphor, like a symbol, for what we see in the world now, stuff that's going on in the world. Those devices, they are used for oppressive reasons. So that's my particular interest, and that stemmed from a painting I created about 10 years ago, called Heidegger's Hut, because again I was just using the internet, and it was I was looking at terms Nazism and technology, and Heidegger's Hut came. You sort of think, well, that sounds interesting, or looks interesting, so how do you proceed? So again, I suppose it's sort of being an autodidact, you kind of take stuff on yourself and research, that idea of this Because it struck me that where, and this is a big issue surrounding Martin Heidegger, was he was a member of the Nazi Party in his early days when he became rector of Freiburg University. He resigned that, apparently, he resigned his membership. And there are a lot of reasons out there for doing that, but over that period from sort of when the Nazis came to power in 1933 to the end of the Second War, he was still writing and presenting lectures. There's no doubt about it, there are anti-Semitic elements within that. And after the war, he went through the process of denazification, but he never once, until his death in 1976, he never spoke about the Holocaust or what happened in his country. And I think he got a lot of criticism for that, but I suppose at the same time that could have been a distraction to what he was about. I'm not making an apology for that, that's just a supposition. So one of his writings was called Building, Dwelling, Thinking, and it struck me as odd that he was presenting this about the home, building, what it's about, and he was living in 1945 post-World War II Germany when it was just a pile of rubble basically. It just struck me as this sort of delusional stuff going on, that it just separated himself from reality. And I suppose you say, well, do you judge the man or do you judge the work? I'll throw that open to you. But from my point of view, it's just very odd that that seemed to be the case, and that the tank that I was using, that painting, specific painting, was a World War II vehicle that the Germans used, and I think in one of your writings about it, you said it became a sort of monastic cell, and it was sort of a kind of protection or opposition to modern technology, because that was one of his big kind of things that he kind of railed against, was modern technology. I think he had this idea of pre-Socratic Greek lifestyle being brought forward in his idea of thinking and what being is, and I can see that. Philosophers and other writers have written about that. And, said he wanted to recreate perhaps a Greek world that didn't really exist, only through its writings, the pre-Socratic writings. So it's just, for me, this idea of the tank is just, as I say, a symbol can be used allegorically, and it just seems to be present in our world very much, in sort of Europe and the Middle East at the moment. So in terms of tank, as say Paul in his essay, his thesis, said he's more interested in drawing than painting, and I think you can see this in the work. There is a drawing element, there's a isographic projection of a cube there, and what have you. And also this ethos of making as well. This idea of nous, of knowing how to do stuff and making the creation as hidden or withdrawn, if I use a Heideggerian term, hidden as possible. So we have to go and examine all this, and that's what we've got to do. We've got to examine the artwork again. It's this bringing forward stuff. I mean, I'm not espousing a Heideggerian view of the world, but we all do it intuitively. You park your bum on a seat and you just take it for granted that it's going to take you away. The floor is there. It's unknown. It's the earth. It's there. So if it breaks or a fire alarm goes off, then the world is brought to our presence, and then it kind of goes further out from here. Stuff happens. I hope that makes sense.
Yeah, but you postulated that it was a painting. Just obviously, you went into quite a lot of detail in your essay around discussing the concepts of that. So could you summarise why you would postulate it in painting? Because my sense, when I came on the exhibition, that he might have been a painter, but they weren't paintings. But obviously, listening to that in the context of saying, well, what is, at what point does it become, or at what point does it move away from, or whatever the.
Well, going back to the sort of modernist agenda, I mean, obviously it's a flat surface. So anything that's a flat surface can be a painting. Now, okay, how the depth of that surface, I think this is what the minimalists were trying to get at. And that has evolved over the years, you know, the decades. And I think it still relied on that, the institution to validate it. So, I mean, you know, when you're painting a door at home, do you consider that a painting? Now, is that a painting? Or is it just a door, you know, an object that has a use from shutting one space out for another, or soundproofing or whatever, you know, as a means of defence, a gate or something like that. So, I mean, I'm talking very much from a philosophical point of view, sort of questioning the being of what is a thing in itself or not, you know. So I left out.
That was what was interesting about it, the idea of, like you were saying, the connection with Paul is that he was exploring similar things, do you see what I mean? As if it's like an expression of that. How do you manifest that idea in something that exists in itself, or it's all those.
Well,
just
I think again, when these were created, I wouldn't. I mean, it was never brought up about objecthood or anything like that. I mean, and I don't think it's mentioned in his essay. I think it's more of a psychological view of the idea of grey and its meaning and metaphor.
Where a grey occurs in the world, and that comes back to that thing of the experience.
Yeah, because
we bring our own experience of grey, which what I was thinking with the places we're painting.
Yeah, because I mean, I was going to talk about the grey zone between an object and us. You know, where do we meet? I mean, Graham Harman talks about that when he's talking about relational aesthetics. Nicola Boreal idea of you know, making soup in a gallery is an art experience. Okay, but then are we turning ourselves into mere objects for consumption as artwork? Because it still needs an art gallery. And okay, I think the plurality of practices now will take it outside the institution, which is, you know, what's needed. But and getting into there, I suppose, of that cultural democracy, which I don't want to go into now. It's a whole other field. But yeah, certainly, I mean, at our respective points of origin of correlating when Paul was making these works, or this degree show work, and when I was sort of scouting around looking for works for the gallery, then I don't think we had that discussion or that deep. No way would I have had that idea. It was just what looks good, and, you know, let's talk about this. So again, there was a more prosaic kind of interaction about artists talking to artists. I mean, my degree show work, I mean, I researched the colour field painters, but I mean, whilst my work was very abstract, it was expressionist, very, I suppose you could say, painterly, but it wasn't flat colour or anything by all means. But what that research did, it certainly gave a background to what was going on in the 50s, 60s, and later on, and enabled me to look at artists that were current when I was doing my degree, you know, kind of who's going to influence you and stuff like that.
Yeah, I was thinking about that. I was thinking that I was talking about a previous session actually. But first I want to say that was an amazing talk. I completely take my hat off to just engaging with words like that.
Well, a dry mouth doesn't help.
And then just a tiny little aside before we ask my question. No, I forget what that was. Was that
totally like passing by that one, so well done for that, yeah.
Not well. I just wondered if that was to live for
I'm usually very good at anagrams of crosscut, but that's
Too short.
It's
Did like his crosswords.
The first thing I do is play with the letters and the words.
No, I just totally
That's quite a title.
Does anyone know if that's to do with
Yes. What we like.
Confirmation.
Okay, my actual question is something that I was sort of starting to talk to Jane about last time. So, what was the thing about the modernist agenda, which I think was the first used in the art school during the 90s then? How do those two different, how and why do those two different cultures come together?
what the modernist agenda.
Yeah, I think you talked about there being a modernist agenda
Yeah.
in the art school during the 90s.
Yeah.
And I'm just interested in that. Why, how did that come about? Why did that
I think
come
it was just the tutors present. I think.
And that particular coming together of things, like I was at art college in the 70s and we had a modernist agenda.
Mm.
I called it a modernist agenda,
Yeah.
obviously there was no choice outside of that. But then you and Paul and Jane and I don't know if Matt was there then, but you experienced that
Yeah.
a couple of decades later, so I wondered whether it meant something different or how.
Well, I think it was probably at the tail end of it. 'Cause I think like some very good tutors, Sharon Hall, Dave Rowling, Pete Owen, and they're all painters, and very painfully painted, if you like. So yeah, I think it was about the materiality that was going on. And, you could have a discussion about something like John Hollywood, George Baselitz, the German painter, and it was about new painting from the 1980s, that kind of idea of neo-romanticism that reinvented itself through painting. And it was painting, there was no kind of otherworldliness, no other kind of, as Freud says, literalist, there was no concept around it apart from being what it was. I mean, we may have titled them to imply something, but certainly in the making, I think it was sort of, titles came later maybe. We started and it was that, again, that subjective how things relate to each other. But having said that, you were involved in optics. Like Mark Chilton was a very good tutor on colour theory and how you could actually achieve grades by putting colours together. And the boundary would be literally a grey area. So optically with paint you could do stuff that was considered rather than kind of just seeing what happened kind of thing. You did have to think ahead if you want.
Was there a big thing around arts autonomy then? Was that was there, so in this application of the modernist agenda, was there a big belief or conviction in arts, the autonomy of arts?
So, I think at that time, yeah, because we had no idea what we were going to do at the art college. It was like just do stuff. And I must admit, I went there to get a degree. I enjoyed it. It was, you were basically getting paid to paint. I did housing benefit, full grant. So again, there wasn't that thing of having to go beyond the institution. And I think this Paul's probably was the start of that, where they were being told to go out and find the venues and situate itself. So there was more of a kind of breaking out of that, getting out the walls of the institution.
Yeah, I had a very different experience doing the pub degree whilst I was on tutor. I felt very encouraged in my so interested in aesthetics, why aren't you more interested in destruction, you know, the deconstructionist and postmodern theories? So it was almost like the opposite way around for me. And then I had to argue for the theorising of abstraction at my MA level. So it was almost the opposite way around. I didn't have that experience at all when I was going to degree in photocopying, I suppose.
I've got one extremely simple question. When did tank get attached to it? Was it before it happened? After it happened? Who gave it that name?
I think Paul did.
Before he did it, or after he did it?
I have no idea.
It would be Richard that would know these questions, and Richard mine that we shared a studio with him.
Yeah, I mean, Richard mentions his he was referencing the First World War tank in a sort of schoolboy kind of fascination. I think that idea that a tank is the tank in terms of the war tank is something which absolutely keeps you out, rejects you, it repels you, threatens and makes you turn away. But at the same time, tank is something which is a container, which it contains, and grey. We've had this conversation as well, Matt, about how grey contains all the colour. So it's perhaps that play. Very much enjoyed a play on words, so therefore could be in there as well. But I think he would have told us about it if he had. But that play, that this idea that something can repel, can reject, that emotionally as well, perhaps, the emotion that the artist, that the audience is bringing, is both one of attraction and also not repulsion, but so much an emptiness as well as a fullness, perhaps. So I think perhaps when he was, you were talking about titles and the theological reading of sort of Newman and Rothko's paintings, whereas the tank, the word itself, that is a stripping bare, even in the title. It's not giving it some the state of confusion on a windy day. He's making it very.
Well, I think the prosaic nature of the word as well, because I think the history of it is sort of more based in Lincolnshire rural life. It was sort of based on farm tractors, and you just put thicker metal around it. And so, what shall we call it? Just tank. It's a tank, you know. Well, I think the Germans have a really, again, the German language, it's Panzerkampfwagen, you know, armoured war fighting vehicle. You know, so it describes it, you know, it really describes what it's for, whereas we tank.
Well, what's interesting, you mentioned the childhood thing, because when I went round, it reminded me of tangrams. You know, tangrams, these you know, the little kind of boxes and tessellations. So they're kind of like, it felt quite evocative of childhood in a weird sort of way. And the grey was, in a sense, like trying to hide the idea that actually what would be this distillation of like the joy to something, you know, so this sort of felt a little bit for me, personally. So that idea that the childhood kind of image of the tank resonates for me.
He very much goes back to his childhood in the dissertation as well, speaking about growing up in Stockport, the greyness, the black and white TV, the world which you kind of interface with, the memory of those times as well, memory being the grey thing, unless we kind of force colour onto it.
Just because it's getting towards sort of 2:30, so that we sort of finish at that point. But I want to bring back to the week's theme of body. And Paul, when we were talking about when we were going to do this talk, you said that it would kind of fit in with the body week as well. So what was the reason behind it fitting in with body? It's not really being mentioned.
anybody notice? But, sorry, what was the question?
So fitting in with the theme of body this week, and you said that Tank would be at home. This presentation would also work sort of under that theme. What was the thinking behind that?
Well, I think it's again the body is how we relate to it, and so that's our size and scale of things. So the phenomenology of things is that we have to relate to it through ourselves and can use science to make sense of things. But so yeah, it's how would it feel if we're smaller in stature or larger kind of thing. That neurological diversity as well. That's an important thing.
That stepping back from
that was that theatrical thing where we say, well, you become part of the performance. And I don't really get that. I'm not sure about that because, it's it is what it is, and again, as artists, you do tend to go and close up and get really close to the surface to see what's going on. Because again, that thing with Alan Charlton is the making of it and the surface of it. Alan Charlton's work, where he uses the whole exhibition space as the artwork, where going back to 97 when I first saw that, certainly had a kind of presence about it on the wall at the back of the space and with it being handled. But again, as I say, that kind of idea of theatricality didn't appeal to me. Sort of, I'd read the essay, but Fried's essay, Art and Objecthood, but I was looking at certain things for my own research rather than thinking about what other artists were doing. So that idea of, certainly for my own research, for my own thesis, going to the tape as it was, and it wasn't tape, but it was still just a tape. I think they had one of Barnett Newman's painting, one of his big paintings on the wall, and examining that close up, and it really was how the artist was kind of making the viewer at a certain distance be enclosed by the whole of the artwork. If you looked straight ahead, all you could see was this blue field of colour. If you just went to the right a bit, you've got these zips going down, and the left hand disappeared, so you were just looking at that. Went the other way again, something that right hand side disappeared, and the whole blue extended to the canvas, and that was it. So again, that was looking at not just the sensuality but the optical effect as well, and how you as a viewer interact with it rather than just sitting on the bench and just looking at it. And similar with the Rothko room as well, the Seagram murals that they managed to get and to just fill the room with it. And I think from what I kind of heard and I've talked with other people about, people go with a kind of expectation already loaded in there to go, well, I'm going to have a spiritual experience. But for me, it was just, how's he created this shape? How's he put the paint on? What was his first coat? What was the second one? When did he actually do the shape, the rectangles and stuff like that? So maybe I was just coming at a more kind of materialist kind of point of view. But then that was it, that was why I was there, and essays written where people crying in front of it. And, I'm sure there are. I don't kind of denigrate that or see it as any less worthy. As I said, that whole body thing is like not just a pair of eyes, optical. We've got a whole kind of nervous system going on with the history and the future.
Any final questions for Paul?
Okay.
So just thank you very much again, once again.
All right, thanks. Come on.